Professors Tremarkin and Petrov and Treisman, Dr. Matt Rojansky, you heard last night. We're going to have a conversation, but you're going to direct the conversation, so I'd ask you to think about questions for them. I'd ask the panelists, given the fact that we have 45 minutes, to keep our answers brief. Not everybody has to answer each question unless you'd like to dive into it. We'll bring Rockland and Belfast in as well. Do we have a first question from this audience? Yes, sir, right here. And the microphones will be coming around right now, right down here. And just please identify yourself. That would help us keep the questions brief. Make sure you attach a question mark to the end of it.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation so far. We have been discussing a personalist regime in Russia currently today. It appears also that a personalist regime tends to double down till the end. If Putin is successful, if Russia as it exists today is successful in East Ukraine, what is the likelihood of a rearmament of nuclear and strategic bombers in Ukraine that took place at the end of the Soviet era? And what would be the impact of such an action?
Okay. Professor Petrov, Matt, you both know something about nuclear balance of terror. Do you want to start? You want to answer that question?
I mean, that's a sort of a horrifying speculative scenario. My sense is that the war in Southeast Ukraine is strategic, but in a limited sense, much more in the sense that you were talking about, Ambassador Burns, of kind of creating a buffer zone or a zone of projection. But that is very much about the post-Soviet space. And what's interesting about the way that Russia's thinking about its own security has changed is that between, say, 5 years ago, and this is just based on published documents, again, I'm not reading anybody's thoughts here, versus 5 years ago, today there's actually less stated reliance on nuclear deterrence as a sort of first-order national security strategy. In other words, we default to the nuclear saber immediately to project Russian power, to assert Russia's interests, and now there's more interest in using conventional forces, this notion of hybrid warfare, and just generally friendly political regimes, which they view as an analog to what they see the West as having done, expanding our sphere of influence. So I think, if anything, that the hopeful answer to that question is what's going on in Southeast Ukraine is horrifically bad, but it is probably not a prelude to a kind of reestablishment of Soviet or Cold War era nuclear force projection against the United States, a few kilometers further into Europe. That wouldn't track.
And I think, just to add what Matt had to say, I think our leadership in Washington makes a critical assumption that President Putin is rational, and he is a very rational actor in my view, and that strategic deterrence can be deployed so we can present a threat that he will respect. And Chancellor Merkel, President Obama have made it very clear, as I said this morning from the beginning of the crisis, we will not fight him in Ukraine. And that's strategic reassurance to him. We are going to oppose him. But the last thing the US and Germany and Britain and France want is a nuclear conflict. The last thing Russia wants is a nuclear conflict. Do you want to add, Professor Petrov, to this?
Yeah, I would not repeat arguments which are clearly put by Alexei Arbatov at recent report at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace website, and he's a great specialist on nuclear issues. I would remind you the story told by Putin himself in 2000 when he was promoting his image. And he told the story from his childhood when he put a rat into the corner and finally the animal attacked him. And I think that it would be dangerous to play similar games with Putin himself, and it's better to let him to die not immediately than to use these kind of arguments.
Thank you very much. We're going to go all the way in the back here. Yep.
My name is Bob Steffen from Bremen, Maine. I would like comments on you mentioned earlier that there were two possible responses by the U.S. and NATO. One, a lethal response, and secondly, increasing sanctions. let's talk about the lethal response. How would that impact Putin's survival and also the situation in the Ukraine?
And just let me interpret the question for, maybe I'll turn to Professor Petrov again, or Matt for this one, unless the other two professors would like to answer this. What is being debated in Washington and in some European countries is not a nuclear response, is to provide, say, anti-tank weapons to the Ukrainian government so that they can elevate their fight and protect their own country against these invading forces from Russia. But it's only been debated, and President Obama has clearly not made this decision. But if the ceasefire does fall apart, I think there'll be enormous pressure on President Obama to make that decision. And I think Steve, I'm sure Constanza will have something to say about this afternoon.
I would agree with European leaders that escalation of the conflict, in case if European army will get lethal weapons from the United States or wherever, will not lead to pacification and to solution. And in my view, the Kremlin needs a kind of managed instability in eastern Ukraine. It doesn't need eastern Ukraine as such. It needs to use it as a leverage to control Ukrainian government. And the more weapons are there, the more military will be response by Russia. And there is no way to win in this kind of direct conflict. So that's why I think the best option is just to not to escalate the conflict and not to try to win it militarily.
Thank you. Professor Tumarkin.
Well, I absolutely agree with Professor Petrov on this. One lesson we have learned is we do not engage militarily, even with weapons, in the sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. And we would just, as you just said, escalate Russian response and make it worse for everybody. And there's absolutely no way that Ukraine can win a war against Russia if Russia throws all its power at Ukraine. So it's a very bad option.
And could I just ask Professor Tumarkin, when you refer to post-Soviet space, you're referring in this case to Ukraine. You wouldn't refer to the Baltic states as because you do have a NATO buildup in the Baltic states.
Oh, I would refer to the Baltic states as well, but of course the NATO commitment puts a different picture on it. But I myself do not think that Putin is going to start moving into the Baltic states. On the other hand, nobody in our field predicted the annexation of Crimea either.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to a question, I think, in either Belfast or Rockland. You'll see it. This is from David Kamonsa in Rockland for Professor Petrov. Okay. So the question is, how is your candidate today possible? I'm not sure how to interpret that question. I think Professor Petrov has, well, I'll let you respond.
I am not that sure that I do understand clearly the question, but
I take it to mean that you've spoken forthrightly, and I admire you for speaking forthrightly. That's how I take it.
Well, I did already try to explain that as working for 15 years for Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I got the image which can be hardly damaged in eyes of the Kremlin, and this makes me not that limited, although the problem in present-day Russia is not about speaking critically with regard to the regime, it's about being listened or being heard. And that's why I don't think they are afraid of somebody speaking abroad or speaking for the very limited, marginalized portion of Russian society. They will not these speeches to be heard by ordinary Russians. That makes me pretty positive. And as I did already tell you, I do not wait for this regime to survive for long. That's why there is no need as well to try to adjust.
Question in the balcony. Yes.
Oh, hello. I'm from Estonia. I'm student at Colby College. And going back to the issue of the Baltic states, Russia is very upset about us being in the NATO, and we in the Baltic states are very happy about being in the NATO. We cherish it a lot, and thank you, Ambassador Burns, for explaining earlier why it is so important for us. So, question for all of you. Some analysts say that Russia might test NATO by attacking the Baltics. Do you think this is possible? Thank you.
And thank you for your question. Could I just also ask the panel to address a second question? So this question is, will Russia attack? The other possibility, which I think is more likely, remembering that Putin's a KGB officer, is an insidious operation to weaken from within through covert operations, which I think is probably more probable. But Professor Treisman, do you have a view on that?
I would say it's not just possible that it'll happen. In a sense, it's already started. An Estonian officer was kidnapped by Russian troops and taken across the border. I think, as Ambassador Burns said, what we have to be most worried about is not a full-scale conventional invasion of any kind, but this kind of hybrid war, these tactics to attack at a level which will create a serious problem within NATO over interpretation of Article 5. I think if they do anything, they will try to intervene in a way which leaves them enough deniability and is at a sufficiently low level that some of the powers in Europe will be reluctant to invoke Article 5 and respond. And I think that would be an objective of Putin, to show that the credibility of NATO is weak. Now, I think I'm not an expert on military strategy and on the level of preparations of the Baltic states, but I do hope that NATO is working very seriously to create a deterrent within the Baltic states. Right now, we've heard about a rapid deployment battalion of about 4,000 troops, which will be able to move fast from one place to another, which I read in the press will be ready by the middle of this year. If that's all that's going on, and I hope it isn't, that sounds to me a little insufficient.
So just a point of information for everybody so we all have a level playing field. What Professor Treisman is referring to is the NATO Treaty of April 1949. And Article 5 of that treaty, and we are a treaty signatory, of course, says that if one of us, the members of NATO, is attacked, then all of us will respond. On the morning of September 12, 2001, we invoked Article 5 for the first time in NATO history. I was the American ambassador. My European and Canadian colleagues came to me and said, we're going to invoke Article 5. We want to defend you from Osama bin Laden. It was incredibly important that they did that. The question here is if Putin attacks or is seen to attack Estonia and Latvia, will we now respond? We have a treaty obligation to do that. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who just stepped down as NATO Secretary General, is a fellow on my program at Harvard. I asked him this week, publicly, at Harvard, if Putin pierces Article 5, do you think NATO will respond? He said, absolutely. So what we're counting on is that Putin's smart enough and rational enough to understand that so that he won't attack. But I think he's going to attack from within, covertly.
Yeah, exactly. If I could say one more thing. The question is not whether NATO will respond if Putin pierces Article 5. It's what does it mean to pierce Article 5, and do the governments of the NATO countries have the same view of that? So they need to coordinate on the understanding
right.
of that article.
So if there's a cyber attack, and there was a cyber attack in Estonia in 2007, will the 28 members of NATO agree by consensus? It's consensus. Everyone has to agree. So if Greece, the new radical Syriza government, decides we're not going to join, NATO can't act. So that's why the Russians sought an early meeting with the Greek foreign minister 2 weeks ago when that government took power. They're trying to weaken and divide NATO from within. Yes.
Good morning. Rick Rector from Camden. Professor Treisman, regarding the $100 billion worth of refinanceable debt, what are the implications of that? And are the Chinese now the lenders of alternative lenders to take place with that?
Thank you for that question. So $100 billion to be repaid this year, roughly. The Russian authorities still have $376 billion in foreign currency reserves, although some of that is tied up in various funds. Essentially, what's most likely to happen is that the Russian monetary authorities, the central bank and the finance ministry will recapitalize the banks, will provide the money that they need to make those payments. Will China step in and help? Only at a price. I think there's some wishful thinking in Moscow that China, and we'll talk about this afternoon, but my impression is the Chinese will strike very hard deals. They won't give anything for free. Putin signed a major agreement on gas supply, I guess about a year, maybe 2 years ago. And they had been unable to agree on the price of the gas for many years before that. What changed was basically that the Russian side capitulated, as one of the negotiators was quoted as saying when he came out of the meeting. He was quoted by the newspaper Vedomosti saying, "They squeezed us like a lemon." So I think that's what Russia can expect from China, rather than generous tens of billions of dollars just to be friendly.
And we will come back to that very subject this afternoon. We have a question from Belfast or Rockland. This is from Larry Flood in Belfast. Is President Putin himself the wealthiest oligarch? And if so, to what purpose? Everybody can answer that question. Who would like to begin? Matt.
Well, this is probably getting tiresome for all of you. I don't know. I can tell you what, as long as Putin is the Tsar, as Kolya said, or the ruler of Russia, he's the wealthiest man on the planet, right? That's what you have to understand, that as long as Putin controls Russia, this has always been true, right, for hundreds of years, that he who rules Russia is the wealthiest man on earth. So for purposes of Western policy, what I would not spend time doing is what I hear a fair amount in Washington, which is a sort of searching for the leprechaun's pot of gold. If we can only find where Putin has squirreled away that 50 billion or that 100 billion, and then we can freeze it, and we can hold him at jeopardy, and we can leverage him. So, that's not going to work. So within the Russian system, you ask about the purpose. The purpose, Kolya spoke to it, Dan spoke to it, is that he can distribute that wealth. He can reward supporters, and then he can take property away from those who support him insufficiently or for other reasons, and he can redistribute it and he can hold it. And that is a very classically authoritarian use of property, and it's very effective.
Thank you. Kolya, Professor Petrov.
Well, I would say that, in my view, Putin is really the wealthiest in Russia, at least, and this is not due to the fact that he's a thief or he wants to have some money to spend, his last years somewhere in a good place. Money is power, and he wants to guarantee his power by all means. And when in 2003, he did order to arrest Khodorkovsky, it was clear sign that he wants to be the richest among richest, and he definitely is. But this money is needed to keep in power, and this creates understandable problems, because if only you can think about replacing him by means of elections, you cannot take away all the property he owns himself or he distributed among his trusted persons. So this is good leverage to keep in power due to both economic and political control, and this makes him similar to some authoritarian leaders in Latin America, in small, tiny states of Latin America.
Thank you. We have a question right here.
Davies Allen from Westport Island. Anybody on the panel, do you believe, what is the sole source of support, militarily and economically, for the rebels in eastern Ukraine? Is it 100% Russia, or are there other factions here?
Very good question. Who would like?
Let me start.
Yeah, please.
Well, I think it would be a mistake to think about Eastern Ukraine as totally controlled and inspired by the Kremlin. And the longer the conflict is going on, the lesser is possibility to control it totally from outside. And there are different calculations according to which about half at least of all rebels are local guys, and they could hardly oppose Ukrainian regular army without getting supplies from Russia. But the problem I see is connected with the fact that the conflict is going too long in order to be stopped if needed, or in order to be fixed without having position of rebels in mind, which makes me sure that they should participate in negotiations in this or that way first. But the problem I see is connected with the fact that the Kremlin is not interested to fix this problem. It's not interested to separate this part of Ukraine. It's interested to keep this instability, and will go on for a long time.
So President Putin, Professor Tumarkin, has consistently denied for the last year that there are any Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. Is that credible?
No, it's not credible. But there has been such a propaganda campaign on television, and most Russian people get most of their news still from television rather than from the internet, that there are people who are really riled up and who believe that it is primarily the rebels there, but I think Russians understand that they are there too. They believe it's credible for him to not talk about it very much, and at some point he's got to be able to acknowledge it more. I think what's more to the point is that American media people seem to think that the Kremlin is in complete 100% control of what's going on in eastern Ukraine, the actions of these rebels. And the New York Times obviously has a policy. It'll never say separatist rebels. It'll never say Ukrainian rebels. It always says pro-Russian rebels. That's the way they only call them, or Russian-backed rebels. And they are Russian-backed. But I don't think that the Kremlin controls them as much as people think they do. I think, and it could be that the Kremlin is really quite worried that some of these people are very, very difficult to manage.
Matt? Can I just make two quick points, right? So on the one hand, I agree with Nina, and by the way, it's not just me, right? So we had General Lute said 2 weeks ago or so, along with...
This is the American ambassador to NATO.
Correct, your successor, said, among other sensible things, that in fact, neither side has full operational control over the people doing the shooting along the line of control, and that's a problem from the standpoint of a ceasefire. You have to go into a ceasefire with the understanding there's going to be friction, right? If the second that shots are fired or there are artillery bombardments, you say, oh, but the ceafire's off, so we might as well go back to full-on fighting. That, I think, is a mistake. That, I think, is where Merkel and Hollande are coming from in saying, look, no, there is still something here. That's one point, right? On the other hand, and this is critical to understand, if you were to do what the U.S. position has requested of Russia, what has been the so-called off-ramp for Russia to get out of sanctions and isolation and so on, at least as far as Donbass is concerned, as opposed to Crimea, which is a bigger problem. In other words, if Russia were to completely pull back its support for the separatist insurgency, the insurgency would pretty quickly grind to a halt. You would still have big problems in reintegrating the southeast of Ukraine. Ukraine itself would by no means be a functional polity. It might not even have this current government for much longer. I think Poroshenko's in a lot of trouble. But without Russia's support, the insurgency fails very quickly. And I think that's a correct assessment by the White House.
Thank you. We have a question in the balcony. Please use the mic. Thank you.
My name is Bill. I'm a lifelong learner from Maine. We've heard a lot of countries mentioned: Greece, Germany, France, the US. Do any of you, or I'd like your opinion as to, given its historic and almost symbolic role in Europe, if Poland has any part in the shaping or resolving of this crisis?
I'm going to refer to one of our professors who wants to give me a high sign here, but Poland has become by far the most dominant country in the eastern part of Europe. And it's now one of the key members of NATO itself, very much opposed to what the Russians are doing. We'll hear more this afternoon, but who would like to take on that question? Professor to Mark, and I'm looking right at you.
Poland has been, of course, a critic of Russia ever since Russia, Austria, Hungary, and the German Empire swallowed up that state in the 1790s. The Polish provinces in Imperial Russia in the 19th century were the most restive, apart from areas in the North Caucasus, throughout the 19th century. And Poland, of course, has particular grievances since it was invaded in 1939 at the time of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. So we see Poland as the strongest international critic. Poland is, I think, frightened of what the world is going to look like, how Putin's power might affect this. I don't believe that Poland will be nearly as key a player as France and Germany. As Germany are. I think the relations between Poland, the relations between Poland and Russia dramatically improved suddenly in April of 2010 with the catastrophe of the airplane crash that killed the Polish government. Do you remember that? And the elite on Russian soil, going to commemorate the 70th anniversary of an event that occurred in World War II. In any event, I think Poland is a country to watch, but it's not coming at the problem from great strength, I think. It's going to be problematic.
One quick point, and then I'll refer to Professor Treisman. NATO had traditionally had 4 big powers: Germany, Britain, France, and the U.S. There's now a 5th that's joined it in the power circle, and it's Poland.
You're right.
Professor Treisman.
I'd just add that Polish leaders have been very involved in the whole crisis over Ukraine. The Polish foreign minister at that time, Radek Sikorski, was very active. He was one of the European leaders who were negotiating with Yanukovych on the last day when everything fell apart. And so they've been involved. Donald Tusk is now, head of the Council of Europe.
Yes, president.
President of the Council of Europe. Part of one of the people who are organizing, trying to put together an EU policy. So individually, leaders of the Polish political elite have been really pretty important in this crisis, both as it developed in Ukraine, trying to manage the problem, and since the Russian intervention.
Thank you. We're going to go to one of our offsites for a question. I think. This is from Eric Schwartz in Rockland. Is there a role for democratic opposition to play in Putin's Russia, or is it the domestic opposition largely insignificant? Professor Petrov.
Well, I would say that, in my view, in order to have opposition, you should have position. And the problem I see is that Putin combines different slogans, populist slogans of different political parties, and those 3 political parties which are represented at the parliament and which are considered to be systemic opposition parties are junior partners of the so-called party of power. But it's not so much the problem of opposition, but it's the problem of a very serious crisis of the political system in general, where the party of power, which is usually compared to CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, isn't party of power at all. It's just a leverage for the Kremlin to realize certain goal in domestic politics, but it doesn't have the right to make decisions and doesn't have the opportunity to influence decision made. And in case of troubles, in case of instability, the fact that the Kremlin was so effective in pushing out any opposition, in destroying any reputations, in having not politicians which are not controlled by the Kremlin entirely, will play a very negative role when it will be needed to negotiate, when there will be a kind of social protest, there will be no political parties, no persons able to do this. And instead of changing persons in power and keeping political regime in this way, they will lead to the end of the political regime in whole.
Thank you. Professor Treisman.
Yeah, just to add that I think organizationally the unofficial opposition is dead. That's in part because of the very clever Kremlin tactics that Nikolai mentioned. In part, it should have been expected because protests go in waves. So after the protests of 2011, 2012, either there was going to be some political breakthrough, some real change, or else it was going to die down. But that doesn't mean there won't be another wave. And I think there was a failure on the part of the unofficial opposition to make a bridge, to make a link between the opposition activists in Moscow and the people in the rest of the country who were discontented for different reasons. But there was never that link really established between people like Alexei Navalny and those out in the provinces. That was a problem. But we'll see more waves of protest, I'm sure, because those people with smartphones and higher education and trips to the West and very modern attitudes haven't disappeared. They're there. There's nothing much for them to do tomorrow. It's not cool any longer to go out in the streets, but I think they'll be back.
Thank you. A question on the balcony.
Hi, my name is Leah Little, and I'm a student at the University of Maine. My question's for Mr. Virginsky in particular. Yesterday, you talked about, very briefly, international adoptions, and I was wondering why it was that Putin specifically went for international adoptions as sort of retribution, and is there any room for policy to change or be repealed, such as the Dima Yakovlev law, to kind of get the adoption process up and running again?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, great question. Thank you. First of all, Dima Yakovlev law, just to clarify, this was the formal legalistic expression of the Kremlin's political answer to the Justice for Sergei Magnitsky Sanctions Act here in the United States, which was packaged with Russia's accession to the WTO, just to kind of pull it all together. And what the Yakovlev law basically did was it forbid, in most circumstances, Russian children from being adopted by American families on the premise, and Dima Yakovlev was one of these, that there was a very small number of cases, we're talking about less than a dozen out of about 40,000 successful adoptions, where Russian origin children, died or were hurt tragically in the United States. But the biggest problem from the Russian official standpoint with those situations was not that the deaths or the casualties themselves were unacceptable. It was that the American system sort of locked the Russians out, didn't let the Russians then come in and save their children, investigate the situation. We claimed federalism and all of the kind of classic bureaucracies that you would expect to happen when there's a tragedy, say, in Texas, and some foreign ambassador comes in and says, let me solve it. What can we do about it going forward? Sadly, I think very little. I think gradually over time we might be able to claw back some normalcy, but I'm actually worried that there will be a lot more casualties in terms of people-to-people connections between Russia and the United States as a consequence of this spiraling tit-for-tat confrontation, which basically has its origins in the geopolitical issues and the human rights issues and so on that we've been talking about. I'm worried that things like the current visa agreement, which more or less should allow at least Russians and Americans to get 3-year multi-entry visas, without any particular stated purpose, for business, pleasure, what have you, for a very nominal fee. I'm really worried that's going to be canceled. That was one of the signal accomplishments of the reset era. You heard it here first. I think there are going to be more asymmetrical, and that's what I mean by adoptions as a response to Magnitsky, as a response to WTO, and so on, consequences to this building confrontation, and that's the problem of unintended consequences. With each step we take, we should think about what might be coming next.
We're at an interesting moment in U.S.-Russia relations, and Matt has put his finger on it. We're seeing now a backsliding by both sides on all the cooperative activities, except for one. The U.S. and Russia are still cooperating to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power. So critical that we keep lines open to the Kremlin on issues like that. We have a lot of questions. We'll try to get them all in the 11 minutes and 10 seconds left. We have one from one of our remote locations. From Greg Russell in Belfast, Russia has a chess-playing culture. The United States tends towards video games. Well, 14-year-olds in the United States tend towards video games. To defend the culture of the United States, does the United States have the patience? This is a great question. Do we have the patience for long-term strategy, Nina, Professor Tumarkin? Are we capable of this long game against Putin?
I think that long-term patience is not our strong suit. Whoever here is from California, I remember somebody in California telling me that forever in California means 5 years. Russians have an enormous capacity for waiting things out, for tightening their belts. I know this sounds absurd, but I sometimes tell my students a story about when I first got my push-button phone, which was called a Princess phone. Remember the Princess phone? And then I was going to get another phone, and I called the phone company. I said I wanted a dial phone again. And the person on the phone company said, "You'll be sorry. You don't remember, you've had a Princess phone, how much effort it takes to dial a telephone number." And I was very rational. I said, "You are destroying America." I said, "We're in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Those people can wait out anything. They can tighten their belts indefinitely, and you're trying to create a populace for whom dialing a telephone number is too much work."
That's great.
So I'll leave it there.
Dan.
I'd just like to say I think there's a big misconception that democracies have no patience and that authoritarian countries have this great long-term view, this vision. I don't see evidence for that. Nikolai said that everybody close to Putin, I hear this from all over, everybody close to Putin says that he operates day to day. He's tactical. He doesn't have a long strategy. And if you think about it, the leader in an authoritarian state has to worry every day about whether he's going to survive till the next, because there aren't these regular moments at which you have elections or a sort of institutionalized challenge. So I don't see this evidence for the patience in other countries. I think it's definitely true, as Nina says, that the Russians have had to tighten their belts. I think most people who live under an authoritarian state have to tighten their belts. Does that mean that they want to, or they're very different from other cultures, other societies? I don't know. But I think anybody can be patient when they're forced to, and the leaders are not patient at all.
And I would agree with Professor Treisman. If you take 4 individuals in our political leadership, John McCain, Jeb Bush, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, I think all of them would agree we need to push back against Putin in Eastern Europe. There's no bipartisan difference here. In fact, you're getting some sentiment that President Obama should be tougher, but I think all 4 of them would say we need to defend NATO. And so I think we may be capable of this, but we'll have to see right here.
Liliana Kostin, Lithuania. Being from a small country, I've been observing 2 big nations, Russia and US, and I found out that at large they are very much the same in behavior. So my question is, what is the percentage of military budget of Russia and of United States, also in monetary dollar value?
The U.S. is spending over $600 billion a year in our national defense. It's a little bit over 4% of our GDP, I believe. The Russians have been engaged in a major military budget buildup, but their military budget pales in comparison to ours, Dan.
Yeah, I looked at this recently. The annual military spending of Russia is 1/10 of the total military spending of NATO, not just the U.S., but of the NATO countries. Russia, I believe, is spending something similar to the U.S. as a percentage of GDP, I think 4 or 5%.
4%. But in absolute terms?
Absolute terms, it's much lower, obviously, because the GDP of Russia is much lower. GDP of Russia is about $2 trillion. But as Matt said, it depends how you count. So there's a range of variation. So if GDP of Russia is $2 trillion, what, 4% of that would be, what?
We'll give him time.
This is hard. Who's got the calculator?
The U.S. is spending more on its national defense than the next 10 countries combined. That's how much we're spending on our national defense. Do you want to come in?
No, I just wanted to ask another question.
You want to? Okay, look, I'll come right back to you. We have a long-suffering person who's been waiting. Number 1, right here. Yeah.
Courtney Haight from Blue Hill. I'd like to return to the comments that were made about the future of oil prices, which we don't know where they're going, in the future. But should they stay as low as they are now or go lower, what does that do to Putin's longevity as far as his regime is concerned?
And Dan, could you help us? Great question. At what level does Russia price oil in terms of its national budget? You can help us out with that.
Right. Okay, on that question, how high does the oil price have to be to balance the budget? That continually changes, and it's actually not a very good way of thinking about it, because if you've got a flexible exchange rate, as it now has, the central bank hasn't been defending the ruble much at all, then the expenses of the budget go down when the ruble goes down. So there's some automatic adjustment. So it's not clear really at what price of oil Russia can balance the budget. In fact, the budget did slightly better recently, but it's all very uncertain at this point. In terms of Putin's future, if the oil price stays low, obviously all these problems that I talked about when I described the current crisis are going to remain if the oil price is low, and they're probably going to get worse. The reserves that the Russian monetary authorities have will run out at some point. And if you buy my argument, that'll have an effect on Putin's popularity, and we'll start to see opposition appearing if his rating falls fast and gets lower. On Putin's longevity, Nikolai's
We're going to turn right to him.
So maybe he should.
Well, when approaching something from the economic side, you can use macroeconomic approach. When you do calculate how much money the country has and how much does it spend in order to understand for how long it can survive using this money. Or you can use a kind of more practical approach, whether the management is capable to use efficiently money, and whether those problems the country is faced by can be fixed by money regardless of how much money do you have. And we do have some prominent economists in our team of experts, and until recently their position was that there is huge inertia and Russia is in a pretty good position with regard to its financial reserves if to compare it to European countries. And that's why they thought that the country had at least 4 to 5 years of more or less stable situation without any changes in governmental spending. Putin recently told that we should wait for 2 years until oil prices will go up. And the government strategy is exactly oriented onto the fact that we should just wait. We should not undertake any serious moves, just wait until the situation will become better. But we do have cutoffs now, even in law enforcement agencies like FSB. It looks like the government, when telling something more positive, is preparing itself for a pretty long period of bad years. But in my view, the problems of the regime are not exactly economic problems. They are managerial problems most of all, and this makes regime much more vulnerable and less self-sustainable than it looks from economic side.
Thank you. We've got 1 minute and 53 seconds left. We've got to have you all go out, all of us go out and have lunch and come back by 1:25. We want to go to a remote location next. From Desiree Genthner in Rockland, President Putin likens the annexation of Crimea to Kosovo. Kosovo independent. Could you shed some light on this?
That's too
Matt.
Well, here's the argument in a nutshell, is that Kosovo, not only, of course, so the Western position is Kosovo was suffering this sort of genocidal attack from Serbia, and so NATO specifically had to intervene, both bombing Serbia, which is this kind of another brotherly Slavic country, so cite historical narratives and so on from Russia's perspective, but also the idea that the West, more or less, without unanimity from the permanent members of the Security Council, including specifically Russia, kind of blessed an independence referendum in Kosovo and more or less, therefore, shepherded the creation of an independent state, which was taken from Serbia. And there's a whole lot of history about why Serbia feels this is their historic heartland. So with all of those historic tropes, go over to Crimea, which is and the city of Sevastopol, a sort of heroic city status, a deeply salient place for Russia. And the argument is here, it is very little different from what the West shepherded into reality in Kosovo, what the Russians helped the Crimean Russians to do, that is hold an independence referendum, vote overwhelmingly in favor of independence. Again, this is the Russian perspective, and then have that respected, not universally. In other words, the West did not respect that, but the Russians did, and then make that a de facto reality on the ground by force of arms. Again, NATO made that happen in Kosovo. That's basically the Russian argument. I hope that's...
May I jump in on this one? Coming from the neighborhood.
Ambassador Popov-Darova of Bulgaria is with us. Yes, jump in on this. This is getting interesting. Well, just on this one, because we'll bring you back this afternoon, but the mic is...
Thank you so much. Actually, just one sentence. There is a major difference, and this is that no one annexed Kosovo. No other country annexed Kosovo. Kosovo is independent, and it is not joined to or forcibly made part of either Albania or any other country. And this is a huge difference between the two cases. Thank you.
And Ambassador Popov-Darova is serving in Washington as Bulgaria's ambassador to the U.S. She's going to join our panel this afternoon. My final word on this, because the American position is, and I was one of the American who helped to negotiate the independence of Kosovo, is that the United Nations Security Council, Resolution 1299, June 1999, after the Kosovo War, said that Kosovo has a right to self-determination. Yugoslavia is breaking up. Crimea, under the United Nations law, the UN Charter, is part of Ukraine. There is a fundamental legal difference between the independence of Kosovo and the theft of Crimea by Putin. We're ending on that note. See you at 1:25.